So some YouTubers out there, like ReviewTechUSA, will complain that people bring up the fact that Nintendo really doesn't care that much about hardware, and instead prefers to focus on making fun games and new, engaging, and innovative ways to interact with and play those games. He'll bring up the fact that the Super Nintendo was about as powerful as the Sega Genesis, in fact maybe more powerful, with exception to its processor speed, and that the Nintendo 64 markets how powerful the console is in the name and was more powerful than its competition, and that the GameCube was second only to the Xbox in the 6th generation era. Well, let me go over some things here. When Sega released the 32X add-on, all Nintendo had to do to mop the floor with it is release Donkey Kong Country, which is just your regular old Super Nintendo game that doesn't even use a Super Effects chip. They marketed it as the first fully rendered game, but it wasn't. It was just using sprites, and the sprites were made from CG rendered images. But it still looked good. The game was fun, and the fact that the game was fun is why it mopped the floor with the 32X. Because the 32X, I mean, some of the games were okay, I guess, but being just okay isn't reason enough to get that add-on, right? Sega was chasing power, Nintendo just like, okay, here's a fun game for you guys, and it looks good, right? We're going to do some like cheap tricks and whatnot to make it look like it's a fully rendered 3D game, and boom, it mopped the floor with the 32X. So right there, Nintendo learned that chasing power didn't equal success. Focusing on making fun games that just look good, regardless of the power of the system, was more important. And the Nintendo 64 got its ass handed to it by the PlayStation 1, a technically inferior console. You could argue it's because the storage space of the cartridges meant that third-party developers couldn't really put all the games onto there. But there were plenty of very fun games on the Nintendo 64 still. Just look at Tarak, for example. Right? You don't need the crappy PlayStation 1 with all sorts of fully recorded audio coming out of it in order to have a fun game. You don't need that. But it still got its ass handed to it by the PlayStation 1. Right? The cartridges, the biggest game I think is like 24 megabytes on the 64, whereas most PlayStation 1 games were like 700 megabytes. Yeah. And the GameCube, you could argue, failed for the same reason, because it used mini discs instead of actual full-size DVDs. And maybe the fact that it couldn't play DVDs. But for whatever reason, probably the storage and lack of third-party support because of it, but for whatever reason, the 64 and GameCube were more or less flops compared to their competition. Technically inferior competition, might I add. So Nintendo learned from that, and they released the Wii. They learned that chasing power doesn't always equal success, so they basically released the GameCube with motion controls. And it outsold the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 by quite a huge margin, which allowed Nintendo to double down on their ideas that chasing power doesn't equal success. They learned all the way back in the 16-bit era that chasing power doesn't equal success, and for 2 generations after they chased power, and they didn't get success. Of course, with the Wii U, they learned the opposite, that ignoring power also pretty much guarantees failure, because the damn thing was an Xbox 360 with a GameCube processor, and it was, horrible. I mean, it was fine for Nintendo games, but for playing third-party games, it wasn't that good. Which I think is why they scrambled to make the Nintendo Switch, which is basically a tablet, but its ARM processor has, the architecture is there for it to support x86 games. I don't know how they do it, but it is there. It's just that to play those games, you basically have to play it like you're playing a PC with all the, a PC game with all the graphics settings turned down. But, so it'll play Doom at like 720p at 30 frames per second or something. But hey, it's Doom. But even the Switch, as I've just obviously pointed out, isn't as powerful as the launch Xbox One or PS4. And it's definitely not as powerful as the Xbox One X or the PS4 Pro, which in my opinion really are the same exact thing as Sega's 32X add-on, except it's a full console where you spend another $500 on it when you spent $500 on launch consoles. Have fun with that, sheep. But yeah, my point is, Nintendo learned that, at least when it comes to Nintendo, chasing power doesn't equal success. But chasing fun games and fun ways to play those games does. And one of his arguments, from ReviewTechUSA was that a lot of the people that argue this are people that, grew up during the GameCube era or something. Well, Rich, I was born in the early 90s. My first console was the Nintendo Entertainment System, and we had all the accessories for it, because by that time it was already, outdated. It was last year's model. But I was like 2 or 3 years old when I was playing it, so what the hell did I care? I remember playing Duck Hunt. I remember playing with that power pad where you get on the floor and start paddling it to do that little track race or whatever. And I remember playing Mario. And I think I recall a Ninja Turtles game where you could walk around on stilts, but I can't. Maybe it wasn't stilts, maybe it was a sword you were holding. But I seem to recall it being in like a StarCraft perspective. Anyways, the point is that I'm not exactly this young kid that only knows GameCube and beyond that. No. I grew up with the NES, I've had the Super Nintendo, I've had the 64, I've even had the Sega Genesis. And I still have my GameCube over there, as well as my Nintendo DS. And I had a Game Boy Color. Right? I've had a bunch of consoles. And speaking of handhelds, by the way, which ones outperformed the others? The Game Boy outperformed the Game Gear and the Atari Lynx, even though it was technically inferior. And Nintendo said using outdated hardware is easier for programmers to, program for, because all the information is already there. Whereas using new hardware, programmers have to spend several years trying to figure out just what the hardware can do. Right? So even back then, in the Game Boy days, Nintendo wasn't exactly chasing power. The DS is basically a mix between a PlayStation 1 and Nintendo 64, whereas the PSP is basically a portable Dreamcast with regards to its graphics. The 3DS is almost on par with the original PSP when it comes to its graphics, while the PS Vita is basically a portable PS 2.5, like a portable Wii or something like that. And yet, in both of those cases, I believe that Nintendo mopped the floor with Sony when it came to the handhelds. Again, proving that chasing power doesn't equal success when it comes to business. So, those are my thoughts. Peace.